I'll begin with the homage to the Buddha and the Triple Gem. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. I want to begin tonight by talking a little bit about my early encounters with Buddhism, in the hopes that that will lead us toward some discussion that's fruitful for everyone. I first encountered Buddhism in my early 20s. I had been feeling a need for some kind of spiritual expression since the end of college, and I encountered a book on a sort of survey of religions which said, "Oh, Buddhism is different." And I thought, "Oh yeah, perfect. I'm looking for different." And so I went out to my local bookstore, probably a Barnes & Noble or something, and found a book called Taking a Path of Zen by Robert Aiken Roshi. This in my early 20s, in the 80s. And I think part of what interested me about Buddhism was the idea that I could study myself, that I could find out something about what was going on with me, and that there wasn't going to necessarily be some being or some person who would be an intermediary in that process, but that it was an inner exploration, and that in some way that would help me to find some more peace in my life. And I would say that's certainly true about Buddhism. That's one way that many people encounter this way and feel engaged with it or feel attracted to it. But over the course of years, things shifted for me. The way that I started thinking about what Buddhism really meant shifted for me. And it became something more like, rather than a study of myself, it became something more like a discovery of this heart and mind, of the world, of certain kinds of principles that were happening around me and in me. And that was a shift. That was a little bit of a different perspective on things, this different perspective on the practice. And in fact, some of you may be familiar with Zen master Eihei Dogen. He was the founder of the school of Zen that I practiced in for many years before coming to the Theravada, who said, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. And to study the self is to forget the self. And to forget the self is to be actualized by all things. To be actualized by all things. So then the practice became something more like there was something that was knowable, and there were some things, let's put it that way, some things, some attributes, some beings, some self, some principles that were knowable, and there were others that were a mystery, a beautiful mystery. And that part of it, the practice, became something really fascinating for me, something that really helped to draw me in further and further. And the Buddha himself, when he talks about what happened to him on the night of awakening, so to be clear, as it's described in the early Buddhist teachings, each one of us has the full capacity within this body and mind to experience the awakening to reality that the Buddha himself experienced. Not necessarily the powers and some other things that came along with that for a Buddha, but definitely the complete freedom and liberation and wisdom is accessible to all of us. That was a key part of his teaching. So when he talks about what happened for him on the night of his own awakening, he says what happened was that he experienced the three knowledges. So speaking of things that are knowable, and the three knowledges that he spoke about, the first one was experiencing more than 1,000 of his previous lifetimes in some amount of detail, knowing what his name was and what kind of food he ate and where he lived, things like that. And then the second of the three knowledges is seeing how beings fared on, is how he puts it, or how it's sometimes translated in English, seeing how beings experienced the results of their actions in their life and beyond that lifetime into another lifetime. And then the third of the three knowledges is the 12-fold chain of what we call interdependent causation, or co-interactive, codependent arising. And I don't want to go too much into the 12-fold chain, but to summarize it, it says something like, due to our ignorance, to our lack of understanding about how things work, how reality actually works, then we create the conditions by which body and mind come into being and experience the suffering of sickness, old age, and death, and then continue on in that process until we are ready to break the chain. Or you could say, unless we're ready to break the chain. So one way to understand this is a kind of moment-to-moment causality, or a kind of moment-to-moment birth. But certainly the Buddha, within the context of his own experience and the context in which he was teaching, meant it in the sense of rebirth. So if we look at those three kinds of knowable principles, then we see that Kamma is very deeply embedded in all three of them. That's really the kernel of what he came to know on that night. Or you could say one of the key factors. And yet, the Buddha also spoke about the mystery of Kamma. He said, so to use the technology properly, so Kamma refers to a sort of principle or a function, and vipaka is the Pali word for the result. Although oftentimes in sort of modern parlance, because karma, the Sanskrit version of the word, has come into the general vernacular, at least in some parts of the West. Sometimes we use that word to mean both things, but I would try not to do that tonight because I think it helps us to really focus in on what we're talking about in terms of the principle itself. But in any event, he said, in a different discourse, he says, there are 4 things which are imponderable or incalculable. The Pali word is achinteya. He said things that if you think about them and you try to figure them out, they will only cause you craziness and frustration. So this was a warning. This is in the form of a warning to us. And the 4 incalculables are, 1 is the scope of the mind of a Buddha. Impossible to know. He also said the scope of someone in jhana, the scope of the mind of someone in a deep state of samadhi and in a state of immersion and collection of the mind, profound immersion and collection of the mind. The scope of that is sort of incalculable, immeasurable, which makes sense because there isn't a sense of the personal boundaries operating when you are in those deeper meditations. So there's a boundlessness feeling to it. And then he said also the world itself, meaning usually understood according to the commentaries as the beginning of the world or the ending of the world or the complete unfolding of the world, how those things are. He said, also, don't set your mind to that, to knowing that completely. And finally, he said, karmic result. Karmic result is an imponderable. It cannot be fully understood by the human mind. So there's a mystery there. And it's fascinating because you see this over and over again in the suttas. The Buddha would say, so if you do this practice for this amount of time and you do it fully to its full development, then this would be the result. Or if it wasn't quite to the full development, then that would be the result. Or perhaps this would be the result. And so he gives, in many of the suttas you see this, he gives a variety of different outcomes for the same practice. Karmic outcomes. Still, karma is something that the Buddha taught quite a bit about. It's a very, very key, you could say it's one of the defining aspects of Buddhism, the particular way in which the Buddha spoke about Kamma, because there were other ideas about Kamma circulating at the time of the Buddha. So as an example, the Buddha says that Kamma is produced by our intentional. So Kamma, the word itself just means action. just means action. And in fact, in the monastic Sangha, we use Kamma in that way. We say we do a Sangha Kamma, we do a Sangha action when we ordain someone or when we take certain decisions within the Sangha. But Kamma as a principle, the Buddha said, arises, kammic results arise out of our intentional actions of body, speech, or mind. So what you think intentionally, what you say intentionally, what you do intentionally. As distinct, for example, from the Jain tradition, which is also a very well respected religion exists up until this day, the Jain tradition, and there were many teachers and samanas in the Jain tradition in the same area of northern India as the Buddha at the time that he was there. In the Jain tradition, it's typically taught that Kamma comes from everything we say or do, even if it's by accident. So if you, for example, you step on an ant by accident, according to the Jain tradition, that would be a killing that would have a kammic effect. But according to the Buddha, if it's an accident, then it cannot have a kammic effect. So this is very key. This is pivotal, right? The impact of our intention on our experience and on the results that we see from what we do in the world. So it's a very clear teaching that what you do matters. What you say matters. Even what you think matters. Race is a good example of that. You know, we know from biology that race does not exist biologically. It's not there. It's all the same bits and pieces. No matter the color of your skin or the shape of your skull or any number of other supposed indicators. And yet we have this idea of race, and it creates all sorts of situations in the world. It has an impact. Even if we only think it and we supposedly don't say or do anything intentionally behind it, it has an impact. So I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. So again, a clear teaching that what we do with intention matters. And yet it's also not a deterministic teaching. Kamma is a very complex teaching, because the Buddha said there are also many factors that go into the way that Kamma works. So let me give you a metaphor, a couple of metaphors actually too, and see if this helps. So one metaphor is to understand Kamma as being something like gravity. So we have matter, and we have space, and we have energy. And when matter and space and energy are present in a particular shape, in a particular place, in a particular time, then we have gravity. Right? We experience gravity on the earth because of the spinning of the earth and its relationship to the sun and everything else that's around. I don't know a lot about it, I will say that. But I know enough to know that gravity is this kind of principle that comes together by a set of conditions, even though it's not a thing arising exactly, right? You can't hold a piece of gravity in your hand. But we see its effects very clearly. We see its effects right? You drop your phone, it falls on the floor. And yet we still don't fully understand gravity. It's so interesting to me. Every once in a while, we'll see some article come out from the science news. Oh, look, there's this thing called a black hole, or there's this thing, you know, called who knows what, all different sorts of twists, different shapes of gravity. We as human beings are still coming to understand what gravity is, even though we live with it every day of our lives. So Kamma is the same way. Kamma is a principle that arises in the midst of the physical and energetic and mental world. Not something we can actually see, but whose effects we can actually see. And in this case, Kamma is, we could say, a moral principle. The Buddha said very clearly, there is dark Kamma and there is light Kamma. And there is also actually also neutral Kamma. It's a moral principle. But it's not deterministic. It's not like you go from point A to point B. It's incredibly more complex than that. There are many, many factors involved. Factors like whether you, if you did something wrong, whether you felt remorse. Or conversely, if you did something positive, something skillful, something wholesome, but then later regretted it or felt resentful about it, then that actually goes in the opposite direction. Or how much you thought about it ahead of time. How much intention went into it. Was it spontaneous or was it something long planned? And various other conditions. There are many, many different examples that are in the suttas. Many, many, many. People ask the Buddha all sorts of questions trying to figure out about what he knew, trying to learn what he knew about Kamma. But in terms of this non-deterministic, that's where the second metaphor comes up. So oftentimes the way I like to think of it is, it's if you know a little bit about billiards, so pool, you know, you have a pool table. Hopefully everybody knows what I'm talking about here. This table with a big green felt on the top, and you have the balls, and you have one white ball, which is called the cue ball. Again, I don't know much about pool, playing billiards. I was awful at it as a kid. That's all I remember. But what I do remember is this, that if you're skillful at it, you can hit the cue ball and just hit whatever ball you were trying to hit. And then that would get it in the pocket. So there are these pockets around the table, right? And you want the balls to go in the pocket. But Kamma isn't like that. It's not that you take one action and it has a sort of deterministic effect. Kamma is more like at the beginning of the game of pool, where you have all the balls racked up except for the cue ball, and you have them all in a triangle in this thing called the rack, right? And there's a triangle there, and you shoot the cue ball at the group of balls, and they all go flying. That's actually, every time you do something with intention, that's what's karmically happening right there. Right? So Kamma is like the energy that's in that cue ball. Boom, and it goes and it interacts with a set of causes and conditions that are already present. With a certain kind of spin, with a certain kind of direction, and so on, depending on all sorts of factors. So for this reason, it's very difficult. Imagine that. Your whole lifetime is like series after series after series after series of that process unfolding. So of course we can't fully grasp that in an intellectual way. But we can see its effects, and we can see many, many pointers that the Buddha gave us about how Kamma works. And I want to suggest that the precepts themselves are some of the clearest pointers that the Buddha gave us about how Kamma works in a human life. Very, very simple, right? Very simple. I take up the training to refrain from taking the life of any living creature. Why? Because that is harmful. Because that is going to generate dark karma. Right? And particularly, again, when it's done with intention, that is a very harmful act to oneself. And I'll say a little bit more about the self part after I get through the precepts. Please remind me if I forget. But there's a very harmful act to one's own karmic stream is a more accurate way of saying it. So what's happening right now with the police killing unarmed black folks, that is incredibly harmful karma that they are bringing on themselves. Very, very harmful karma. And that's why we have to say something about it. We have to speak out about it as best we can. So I want to get through all of the 5 lay precepts, but just to say, the Buddha has given very specific teachings around this, around our obligation or our a strong recommendation on his part that we should speak up whenever we can to intervene so that harm is not caused. So maybe I'll just digress to that very briefly. So in the Anguttara Nikaya, the numerical, so-called numerical or numbered discourses, there is this discourse by the Buddha in which he's having a conversation with Potalya. And Potalya is a wanderer, another seeker there in northern India. And so the Buddha puts a question to him, and he says to summarize it, because you know how the suttas, the old Pali suttas go, they're very repetitive, the language, and so to save you some of that repetition, I'll just sum it up. He says there are four kinds of people, and he does this often. There are 4 of these, or 3 of those, or 6 of those. It's not intended to be pejorative. It's just intended to be ways of focusing our attention on choices, actually, that we have in terms of how we live our lives as human beings, as practitioners. So there's somebody who criticizes somebody who deserves criticism by saying something accurate and truthful and timely, but doesn't praise someone who deserves praise. Or there's someone who offers praise to people who deserve praise, but they don't criticize folks who deserve criticism. Or there's someone who doesn't offer either praise or criticism at all. Or there's someone who does both, praise folks who deserve praise and criticize folks who deserve criticism. And so the Buddha puts the question to Potalya, and he says, well, which one do you think is the one that's most appropriate? The most appropriate kind of behavior? And Potiala says, I would say it's the person who doesn't offer either praise or criticism. He says, for what reason? Because what excels is equanimity. What excels is equanimity. And to some folks, this might sound like a very reasonable answer. This might sound like a very spiritual answer. The most important thing is equanimity. But the Buddha's response was that in his view, the most appropriate was to speak praise when it's accurate and truthful and timely, and to speak criticism when it's accurate and truthful and timely. That our silence is not necessarily helpful. Or as the good Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, silence, there comes a time when silence is betrayal. There comes a time when silence is betrayal. So we have to be careful as unenlightened human beings, as I am, and I imagine all of you are, that it's not always easy for us to know when is the time for praise and when is the time for criticism. So those are the times when we're not sure, those are the times to be quiet, to be still. But when it's clear that harm is being caused, the most compassionate thing, one of the most compassionate things we can do for another person is to intervene and do our best without causing harm to them either. I'm not advocating harm at all, but without causing additional harm. Our most compassionate thing that we can do is to intervene and stop someone from creating harm in the world. Because we are compassionately preventing them to the extent that we can, or encouraging them not to create harmful karma in their own stream. Just like the Buddha said to Angulimala. So who is Angulimala? Angulimala was a serial killer. His name means necklace of fingers. He had a pact with his teacher, who was obviously not the Buddha, to kill a certain number of people, and he kept a finger from each person that he had murdered in order to keep track of the number of people he had killed. So he'd know when he was done. And he wore that around his neck. That's what who Angulimala was. And the Buddha heard about this person and went walking in the area where Angulimala would often kill people. And as the story goes, he wasn't able to catch up to the Buddha, right? Because of the Buddha's powers, or because of some way in which the Buddha was very skillful by being in his presence, but not in a way that he could be attacked. And so Angulimala calls out to the Buddha and he says, "Stop, stop." And the Buddha turns to Angulimala and he says, "You are the one who must stop. You are the one who must stop." So we have a very strong recommendation here from the Buddha about expressing to the best of our ability our understanding of what's wholesome and skillful and what's harmful in the world. Let me just keep going through the precepts and then we'll stop for some Q&A. So that was the precept of refraining from taking the life of another living creature. And then the second of the 5 lay precepts is refraining from taking that which is not given. Right? Usually this refers to stealing. And although we try very carefully not to expand the scope, so to speak, of the precepts, I would say that this particular precept also includes a certain kind of taking what's not given from other people, of things, not material things. And by that I mean like not paying people a fair wage, or crossing on the left turn on the red light and having that person beep at you because you could have waited your turn, in a very minor example. But there are ways I think that we know when we're taking what's not given. We get feedback about it, even if it doesn't mean literally stealing. And then there is refraining from sexual misconduct. So all of these things are really up in our society right now, right? The killing of unarmed, innocent people, the unfair labor policies, taking what's not given, the sexual misconduct, right? The Me Too, that was the whole Me Too movement. Or sexual scandals within the Catholic Church, within Buddhist organizations. Right? Or in one's own life, in your own personal life. There's a brilliant video that I came across a while back, and I haven't seen it in quite a while now, so I can't recall who it is that put it out. I think it was some anyway, it's from the UK, and maybe it's the police of a particular area or something like that, and they did this video about basically saying consent is like saying yes to a cup of tea. So if you offer somebody a cup of tea and they say yes to the cup of tea, and then you go off and you make the cup of tea and then you offer it to them and then they say no, you don't force it down their throat. You just set the cup of tea aside. Right? Or if you offer somebody a cup of tea and then they pass out and they're not able to take the cup of tea from you when you're ready to give it to them, again, you don't pour it all over them. You don't force the tea on them somehow. You just let them be. So in that way, there's this kind of humorous but also very serious way of talking about consent that I found really helpful, and in a way that people could start to relate to what we're talking about there. And then false and harmful speech. Refraining from false and harmful speech. So that was the topic of the teaching that I gave today for San Francisco Dharma Collective. And as I said then, a few hours ago, that is one big, messy, hairy, important, beautiful, timely topic. We could spend weeks and weeks and weeks just talking about that. But to sum up, there's and you can, the video and audio for that will be posted soon, I hope. But to say, the Buddha said, speak that which is clearly truthful and accurate. Substantial is the word that Bhante Sujato uses. I appreciate that. It has some value, it's expressing something that needs to be said. Something which is beneficial, and by beneficial we mean conducive to the path of liberation, something which helps us to discover truth, to discover reality, to discover the nature of dukkha. And something which is not harmful. right? So the beneficial and the not harmful go together. And then he said, it's nice if it's liked. If it's liked, then always say it. If it's truthful, beneficial, and liked by the person receiving it, then by all means, say it. That's easy. If it's not liked, if it's not going to be liked by the person who is receiving it or the people who are receiving it, the Buddha said, find the proper time. Once again, he didn't say be quiet, stay silent, don't say it. He said find the proper time. And I would say the Dhamma is often like this, right? We may or may not want to hear what it is that the Dhamma has to tell us. Sometimes we don't like it when it lands. But the proper time can come. The time when we can actually receive it, when we can take it in. Even sometimes when that initial response is rough. So we do our best to try to ascertain that. But always, he said, always stay silent if what you are going to say is harmful. He said there's no reason. He could not find a single reason why. Even things that were truthful, even things that somebody might like to hear, you would never say them if they are harmful. And then the last of the 5 precepts, refraining from intoxicants. So this is usually understood in the Theravada. It's not an ethical precept. It's there because, as the English translation says, in the Buddha's experience, when we become intoxicated, then we become careless and we are much more likely to break the other precepts, the ethical precepts. So, again, pointing at the way in which we can, intentionally or unintentionally, obscure our understanding of how things work, and then make mistakes that will cause us difficulty. So my last metaphor for you tonight before we go to Q&A is to say this. If we sum up the teaching of Kamma, if I try to do that in a perhaps relatable way, you could say that the relationship between the earth and a tree is very clear, right? A tree is a manifestation of earth. It's based in the earth. It started by a seed. It's grounded in the earth. It's made of earth. It arises as earth. It has branches and leaves, all of that earth, flowers, earth. Then at some point it completes its life cycle and the tree dies and falls over and returns to the earth, right? It becomes, again, a part of the land. When we're out there, sometimes here in the forest, we go out there and gather up the kindling, especially before the fire season starts. And sometimes you have to decide whether this particular piece has already started returning to the earth, or whether we will pick it up and bring it in as kindling. And in the same way, a human life is that. It's an expression of Kamma. It's fully made by Kamma, informed by Kamma, expression of Kamma, moment by moment. And then the end of that human life comes, and still it returns to Kamma. And the Kamma, the momentum of what has happened but not resolved, because there are karmic effects that have been initiated but not resolved, in one particular lifetime, at least as the Buddha taught it, those things stay in a stream. They kind of hang together, and then again a new tree comes up. So is it the same tree? It's not the same tree. It's a different tree. But is it related to that old tree? Well, yeah, sure. Very much related. Or the kind of classical way of talking about this is waves, right? A wave is completely made of the ocean. It's just the energy of the ocean rising. It has a peak, it has an end, it goes back into the ocean, but still there's some momentum there, and then from there arises another wave. So I hope that this has been helpful, that you really do your best to express your understanding of Kamma in your life, in your practice, in the way you speak, in the way you act in the world, in the way you treat yourself on the inside. Because it matters. What you do, it really matters.